It was, and Mendel knew it was, and Mendel was not an evolutionist at all, not at all. He was specifically opposed to evolution, and that has been quite misrepresented. So let's see what Steve Fuller has to say. He's got something to say on it. Darwin fundamentally resisted the idea that nature possesses a machine-like structure that might imply, as it did for Newton, a divine mechanic. This came out of his inability, if not refusal, to fathom the mathematical formulae that purported to provide evidence for statistical laws of heredity, sent to him by Gregor Mendel shortly after publication of Origin of Species. Because there's another myth, you see, that people just didn't know about Mendel's work. Well, they did know. Darwin himself knew. So it wasn't that they didn't know about it. What happened was that they rejected it. This was why it needed to be rediscovered or re-highlighted. I mean, it had always been known about 40 years later. But can you see what I said at the beginning? That we have this trajectory, this very fruitful trajectory going from Ray through Linnaeus, through Mendel, 300 years of fruitful development. Darwinism was a complete sidetrack that had nothing to do with it except that it held it up. And because of this problem, that Mendelism did not support Darwinism, the results were rejected on ideological grounds. Now again, I've got papers with me, not written by Christians, that will spell this out to you, not written by creationists. Remember that Darwinism was seeking to eliminate the designer. That's what it was all about. And Mendel's theory of inheritance ruled out Darwinism because it supported the creationist idea of a designed capacity for variation. It showed that the capacity for variation had been there all along. Darwinism needs new variation coming from who knows where, and he didn't know where, of course. And that was a big problem with Origin of Species. So I'm telling you that people seriously need to read their history as we approach the Darwin bicentennial. Because the picture is that that the publication of Origin of Species swept everything before it. Well, it swept a lot before it, it has to be said. Huxley, Thomas Henry Huxley, launched a popularizing, well, Darwin launched it, I think, but Huxley did it, went around the country, and he wasn't the only one, but he was very successful, promoting Darwinism. Many, many people turned to Darwinism, but not most scientists. It was accepted by the church, it was accepted by the general population, but it wasn't really accepted by, well, it certainly wasn't accepted by all scientists. I wouldn't like to hazard a guess at the percentage, but it probably was a minority that accepted it. Because contrary to popular accounts, Darwin failed to offer a properly mechanistic account of evolution because he lacked a credible theory of hereditary transmission. Listen to this. Indeed, by the time Origin of Species reached its 50th birthday in 1909, Darwin's theory was close to extinction in biology, though it continued to enjoy admirers in theology and sociology. So it was essentially a sociological theory, you see, that was given a biological twist by Darwin. Herbert Spencer, I mean, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not claiming to know a huge amount about that side of it, but I do know that the idea predated Darwin in the realm of economics and sociology, and the survival of the fittest sort of idea. And it was Darwin introduced it to biology, but he did not have a theory of how it could happen. Not in terms of the actual inheritance, the sort of thing that Mendel was working on. In fact, Darwinists could only offer just so stories to explain species change. Remember, this is Steve Fuller writing, professor of sociology and history of science, expert in the history of science, who is not a creationist or a Christian. So Darwinism floundered. Now, Mendelism, to go back to Mendel, floundered for 40 years because of the fact that it didn't support Darwinism. Some people sympathetic to Mendelism helped to resurrect it in the early part of the 20th century. And that created an even bigger problem for Darwinism, because now genetics was moving forward, but it still didn't marry up with Darwinism. Now, again, this is something people don't appreciate, and again, Steve Fuller has something to say about it, and he doesn't mince his words. And these are not my words. I don't even know if I agree with this, but I thought, well, see what you make of it. Contrary to how the matter is sometimes portrayed in folk histories of science, evolution became the common theoretical paradigm of the life sciences only once natural history and experimental genetics were unified in the 1930s and 1940s. Listen to this, in carefully crafted textbooks and popular histories as the neo-Darwinian synthesis. This feat was largely the work of Theodosius Dobzhansky and Julian Huxley. If it appears that the life sciences have been brought closer together in the aftermath of their efforts, that is due at least as much to the concentration of financial backing and political interest as to genuine intellectual breakthroughs in molecular biology. Now, isn't it interesting when sociologists get let loose on all of this? You see, it gives you a completely different perspective, doesn't it? Well, I don't know about the financial backing and political interest thing, but I do know that until the 1930s and 40s, Darwinism and Mendelism were on two different paths, and it was the genetics that was being established and the Darwinism that was not. And they managed to marry them up in what became known as the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the 30s and 40s, with the idea that mutations at the level of the DNA produce the raw material for natural selection to act on. But today, that neo-Darwinian synthesis is being seriously questioned by evolutionists behind closed doors. They wouldn't dare say it very much in public, because, not that I've been behind the closed doors with them, but it does occasionally leak out. And you can see why. Because Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, any kind of Darwinism, depends on the idea that small random DNA mutations with small effects account for evolutionary change. But the more that's discovered in the fields of molecular biology and genetics, the harder it is becoming to provide neo-Darwinian explanations. Let's take just one example. How can neo-Darwinism explain the origin of meiosis? Now remember, it's got to be able to explain everything. If it can't explain everything, it doesn't work, does it? So I don't know if you can remember what meiosis is if you're not a biologist, if you learnt about it at school or since. It's a very, very mysterious and complicated thing. And meiosis is the form of cell division that gives rise to the gametes, the sex cells. Without it, there can be no sexual reproduction. Because I'm sure you're all aware that your cells have a certain number of chromosomes. They do in plants and animals. And the sex cells have got to have half that number, because the number of chromosomes is definitive. And you know that terrible conditions result if you have just one too many, normally fatal. I mean, occasionally, as we know, there are one or two conditions where you can survive with an extra chromosome. Normally, if that happens, it's fatal. So you couldn't have a double set. So sex cannot evolve, sexual reproduction cannot evolve until you have meiosis.